Today, we're going to talk about proactively avoiding harassment and bias incidents before they happen. If the EEOC gets wind of a complaint involving sexual harassment or discrimination, the employer could end up paying in more ways than one to mitigate the damage. Earlier this year, a Georgia-based oil company agreed to pay $400,000 to settle an EEOC sexual harassment lawsuit. The agency also recently took a fast food franchise owner to court for allegedly failing to address harassment. The settlement was nearly $2 million. To help you assess your risk and explore ways to proactively manage it, we've called in employment law compliance expert, Janine Yancey. Janine Yancey is a lawyer and the founder and CEO of Emtrain. She recruited a team of Silicon Valley experts in product design and learning to create a unique culture tech platform that provides information and advice to employees and analytics to employers to stop harassment, bias, and ethics problems. Janine's vision of democratizing access to information and guidance and creating a global solution to these workplace problems have put her at the forefront of thought leadership on sexual harassment, bias, and ethic issues. She advised the California State Senate in 2018 on a harassment training mandate and helped draft a regulation which went into effect in 2019. Janine is a sought-after expert and speaker and has been published and interviewed by The Washington Post, USA Today, ABC, MSN, CNET, Bloomberg Business, TechCrunch, and Startup Grind. Janine, welcome to Voices of HR.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
So this is such an interesting topic, and one that most organizations struggle with. And I love that you have now created a tech platform that not only helps the employee, but helps the employer. So tell us how this all started, because you're an employment attorney. I think you have a history in HR. So tell us where that tipping point happened, where you saw an opportunity to help in a different way.
Yeah, thank you, Britta. So it really was the result of years of litigation and workplace investigations. And so work in the trenches for my HR leader clients. And seeing the same behaviors over and over and over again lead to similar outcomes. So I kind of think of myself as the workplace therapist, where you have so many people in front of you in a chair telling you their story, and you kind of know how it's going to end. And I think most employment lawyers have that similar experience. And I really just used that experience to identify a set of skills that we can teach people so that they can avoid conflicts, proactively.
And so was there any pivotal moment or any investigation where you stepped back and you said, okay, these employees need help and the employer is at risk because they're not addressing or training or providing the information? Because I find it really concerning that in 2023 that we still have sexual harassment lawsuits, that we have 68% of LGBTQ that is being harassed within the workplace in 2019. So, and I suspect that that has increased now in 2023. So if you can, do you have any insight into why this is still occurring within our workplaces? And is it still occurring even in a virtual environment?
So the short answer is yes, it's still occurring in a virtual environment. And actually, there are some studies indicating that it actually becomes more difficult in a virtual environment because of the lack of social kind of connective tissue. That's how I think of it, right? So the lack of relationships, it basically takes away the shock absorbers, if you will, to our human interactions, which then if we kind of connect to your first question, why is it still happening in 2023 when we've been focused on these issues? We first started focusing on these issues in the 1970s.
Yes.
But it was in the late 1990s, 1998 and 1999, that we first, started talking about harassment training prevention as a tool, if you will, to get us better conduct in the workplace and try to eliminate sexual harassment. So, that's been 23 years that we've been doing sexual harassment training. And it's still happening 23 years later because I believe we've been viewing this as a policy, to socialize a policy. And I've written hundreds of these policies as an employment lawyer, and all you can do in a policy format is talk about, quote, unwelcome behavior, end quote, right? That's the legal standard, unwelcome behavior. And you might be able to give, some out of context examples of what that could look like. But that's not nearly enough when you're talking about a workforce that's 5 generations, many, many different races, many, many, many different cultures. What does unwelcome behavior look like? I mean, if we think about it just in the most simplistic idea of, getting up to introduce yourself to a new person, you have one way of doing it in America. You probably have a different way of doing it in India, a different way of doing it in Africa. I mean, there are different behaviors for different regions, and we haven't acknowledged that. And so we're navigating a melting pot of workforces with different comfort levels, different social norms, and we haven't given anyone the tools or the skills to navigate those in a more efficient way.
Yeah, because, you're absolutely right about the 5 generations in the workforce. We're now starting to see more women than ever before in the workplace, more women of color in the workplace. And no one really has cracked the nut on how do we create appropriate integration and maximize diversity within the workplace. It feels like there is so much more conflict than there is resolution or proactively trying to help these groups of people move the agenda forward for an organization. Are you seeing that?
Yes. And I think that's why we continue to have employee conflict, in our workplaces. And employee conflict can simmer, at the team level and result in inefficiencies and lack of productivity. Or it can boil over into actual claims of harassment and bias. And it really is connected just like that, right? So, our work at Emtrain is really designed to put out a skills matrix, if you will, showing that, inclusion is a set of skills that we can all practice and develop. Respect is another set of skills that we can all practice and develop. And that way we can be more intentional in understanding what actions are going to get us better results.
So what are some of the actions that employees are partaking in displaying in the workplace today that are getting companies in trouble? Because our Voices of HR audience are all of these fantastic HR pros. Some of them are one-person shops that have the world of HR on their back and they need to carry it forward. And they need to know what their risk is and what is actually happening within the workplace. So what are you seeing based upon the data that is happening today that employers and HR needs to start taking notice of?
Yes, very good. So I would say harassment claims, I'll just focus on those to start with. 90% of harassment claims really flow from managers that are not using their power in a savvy way, right? So most of us, I'm a former management side employment lawyer. If you were to talk to similar folks, other management side of employment lawyers, I think all of us would consistently say that most of the harassment claims against managers are managers that are well-intentioned, that just are not skilled and experienced in how their directives could be processed and perceived by subordinates who have less power and might take things, in a really, personalized way that was not intended. So one of our skills is, managing power skillfully. And so part of that is understanding, okay, if I ask a direct report this, how are they going to process that? What are the potential, reactions that person might have? And thinking through that before you actually exercise your power, right? The other subset of harassment claims are flowing from what we call in-group, out-group dynamics. So it's, groups of people that are connected and ostracizing / alienating, people that don't fit in with their group. And that's why you see the crossover between harassment and diversity, which, here at Emtrain we talk about quite a bit. We have a research paper that we published last year showing the data that connects harassment and bias claims with diversity.
I think, for those organizations who had good intentions with diversity, which we're just going to give everyone the benefit of the doubt and say, yes. They made the first step, right? They started hiring diverse candidates. And obviously both of us are women, and, good for them. We both have really great careers because of it. But the one thing that was lacking was the knowledge base, the training, the insight to see what was going to then happen within the workplace, which always amazes me because companies spend millions of dollars on strategy, right? Looking at the marketplace and determining what their next steps are and how do they create the change management around that. But they never did it, or most did not do it for diversity. And so you do now have this conflict in the workplace. So can you give us a couple of specific examples of managers who are maybe well-intentioned, but not, or are misplacing their power when it comes to harassment, or groups that are misplacing their power when it comes to harassment?
Absolutely. So for managers that are misplacing or not exercising their power in a healthy way, would be anytime there's a directive. Well, I would probably, put it into two different cohorts. So one, anytime there's a directive where there seems to be a non-business and personal benefit to the manager, right? And I think where we see that materialize is the manager mistakenly believes that there's a stronger personal connection relationship with the manager and that direct report than there really is business relationship. But because they might have a nice rapport and a nice social connection, that manager might not think anything of putting out a request like, oh, do you mind doing XYZ for me? And it's a personal request with a personal benefit. And that direct report is, caught in a tricky situation where that manager has power over their employment and their job. And so they feel compelled to acquiesce. Right. So there's that group of conduct. And then in terms of, so the managing power, and then, in-group, out-group dynamics. I think you were also asking about.
I did.
And again, that's a manager's kind of real responsibility. Always be on the lookout for that, right? So do you have, let's say you've got a team of like 5 or 6 people reporting to you. Are there pretty healthy social connections equally distributed throughout that team? And if not, can you as the manager or people leader start to build some of those connections? Because if they're not equally distributed, and let's say there's 3 direct reports that are very connected socially and 1 or 2 that are not, it does not take long for the 1 or 2 that are not well connected socially to feel like they're more vulnerable and getting less favorable opportunities and job impacts than the others. And that's, it's like clockwork. It shows up time and time again.
And so what is the answer? Because I think, as a CEO, obviously, of a tech training organization, you have solutions that you can bring to bear for organizations who need to be more in tune with the fact that this does happen. And the big concern I have with regards to any type of harassment or diversity bias is that there are so many C-suites and leaders who have a different perception of how their culture is executed day by day than what is actually happening. I found that with the research in my book. They did not want to hear that women, primarily women, are being targeted, bullied, and abused in the workplace. It's just a notion that most people cannot fathom in 2023, but it happens all the time. And women don't come forward. And some of them leave the workplace altogether and halt their career because of it. So there's such a significant downstream impact, not only to the company, but to the individual. So the question I have for you is, how do these HR pros, identify what's happening in their organization? And number 2, how do they get the attention of the C-suite to either use your platform or pursue a solution?
So I think HR leaders need to start to measure their culture. So right now, HR leaders are measuring, recruitment. They're measuring retention. They're measuring, succession planning. They're measuring the more objective, more, frankly, the easier things to measure, which is a great place to start.
Right.
But most of these things are already in the past by the time they're lagging indicators by the time you have the actual number, right, to share with your C-suite. To get a real-time number, you need measurement of the social dynamics that are leading indicators of what you're going to get. So like what we like to say at Emtrain is, we are capturing and measuring and scoring your respect within your org and your diversity and inclusion with your organization, which is a leading indicator telling you proactively what you can expect, right? And so it really comes down to identifying the skills that are instrumental in getting you the behavioral outcomes. And that's why, for us, we take a skills-based approach on respect, and we take a skills-based approach on inclusion. There are 4 skills for inclusion, 4 skills for respect. And within the learning experience, we're pulsing on and measuring those skills in different teams, and then teeing that up for the HR leader to see which teams are high scoring versus which teams need some help and coaching, and then wrapping that all up into a organizational score, which give any CEO a score, and that CEO is going to look at their score. That's.
It's data. It's data. So you have these 4 inputs into inclusion and respect. Are those universal? Or are those unique to the organization? So are those key drivers?
Yeah, so those are, our universal skills matrix that we recommend. Um, I'm waiting to see, but we're working with our clients and other partners because, you know, we're now starting to move into, I think, as an HR industry, into
Mhm,
looking at everything from a skills based approach, which I think
mhm,
is the right thing to do when it comes to compliance and culture topics. I have not yet seen a lot of organizations unpack the behavior into discrete skills, right?
mm,
Which I think is the benefit that we can bring to organizations.
absolutely. And so you have real-time data that goes to HR. And let's say that there are some indicators that there's a problem, and HR can see that real time so they can act. Because I always say that, HR really is responsible to ensure the culture is executed. Not that they do it, right? Because everybody has to participate in that, but somebody has to own it. Somebody has to own the culture and the indicators. So the red light goes to HR. What happens next?
So they will see it's HR or like the employee relations team within HR, and they'll see, okay, let's say you've got a workforce of 1,000 people, and you've
Mhm,
got different teams, different regions, and so forth. They'll see, okay, this team over here is underperforming in managing power. Let's look at the people leaders
mm,
in that team, and they're underperforming in managing power. It's a skill. We could teach them to manage their power more inclusively, more
mhm,
respectfully. And so it's just, instead of having your HR business partners or your employee relations team trying to boil the ocean, which is
mhm,
usually what they try to do, and in a very
mhm,
reactive mode, it's giving them advanced data just like every other function has already on no, 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 you don't have to talk to all 1,000 people.
mhm.
Go talk to those 5 people. And
Right.
that's where the problem is.
And so, how do you capture the data? And are the employees trained on the definitions? Because one of the things that I found in my research, and I don't know if you've seen the same thing, is that, even with sexual harassment, women are reluctant to come forward because they don't know for sure if it really fits the definition of sexual harassment. They don't want to kick up dirt. They don't want to create any issues for themselves or for their boss who sits in a position of power. So to me, it all starts with the definition and truly understanding what's expected. So, is there pre training?
No, it's within, so we have what we call our foundational courses and then our skill building courses. And the skill building courses are really recommended, as in reaction to your heat map, basically, where you're strong
Mm,
versus where you're weak, right? And in our foundational courses, so let's take for example our preventing workplace harassment course.
hmm
Everyone, whether you're a people leader or individual contributor, are walked through the skills that we all need to jointly create a workplace that we all feel good about, right?
hmm
And so at the individual level, it's mitigating our biases. At the people leader level, it's managing your power inclusively and
hmm
respectfully. Um, and then there's also thinking systemically. So we've got skills outlined,
hmm
and that we're sharing with every single person who is a learner. And then we're showing usually video scenes illustrating that skill,
mm
and then right after that asking an employee or a learner, you know, how good is your manager at that? Really
mm
good, so so, not so good, right? And
mm
everyone is anonymous, so it's de-identified. So we're
mm
just getting responses and we're mapping the responses next to the skills so that we can see the strength of those skills, and then we can slice and dice in the workplace and in the organization to see, where those skills are underperforming.
So one of the things that is absolutely necessary if you put an infrastructure like this in place is that HR also has the latitude to act, because I guess the last thing that you would want is to start soliciting data and information from employees. And let's say there's an indicator of someone who is abusing their power, because we know that unfortunately there's too high of a percentage of people in leadership positions who shouldn't be, right? Who are not demonstrating the culture, the leadership attributes that company and usually universal attributes as well. So what does HR need to have in place in order to be able to act? Do they need the C-suite's blessing? Give me a best case scenario there.
Yeah. So just a little bit of, table setting, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
So we will never, report on individuals.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So we won't go lower than a team of 5, because psychological safety is required for everyone. Really.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, even in the executive ranks, these are sensitive personal issues. No one wants to feel like they're not a good manager,
Mm-hmm.
or that they're somehow biased, or they don't know how to exercise power respectfully. You have to preserve psychological safety for everyone. So that's just kind of a prerequisite. Beyond that, employees that are learners can see generally how their organization is experiencing a certain skill vis-a-vis the benchmark of the whole ecosystem, right? So all of our Emtrain clients, so they'll have that visibility. And then on the administrative level, HR leaders get more granular visibility. They will actually get a heat map. It's not visible to the end user. But to follow up on your question, I think, HR leaders need to have the flexibility and, the appetite to start to measure what matters and be prepared for recommendations on how to improve it, and have a little bit of capacity to apply some of at least your staff time and resources to areas of the organization that require some coaching.
Yeah, because what are the consequences for organizations if they don't? I mean, regardless of whether you have data that is real time or not, there are implications and consequences to companies who do not address individuals who are misusing power, sexually harassing, not leading appropriately.
Right.
I remember I saw a stat that teams under those types of individuals can decrease productivity up to 80%. Up to 80%.
Yeah, I'm not surprised. So I think you think about it at different stages, right? So the first stage is probably a lack of productivity because people are spinning out and focusing on the style rather than trying to get work or the business done. The second stage is probably, spinning out of the organization, so turnover. And then the third stage is probably claims.
And are you seeing, I know you're out in California, but I suspect you also have a federal view, EEOC view of sexual harassment claims. And we've had a couple of different attorneys on the podcast before, and I know their opinion was that sexual harassment claims and suits that have validity typically pop to the top, that the courts are supportive of A, hearing those types of cases, and B, acting upon them if the evidence suggests itself. Are you seeing that? And should companies be aware?
I would say the trend has been more litigation, not less. And we actually have a global reach. And in our clients in Canada that didn't even used to have litigation in the same ballpark as the US, They're starting to have litigation up there.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's really because of our demographics, where
Mm-hmm.
our younger workers are very comfortable shining a light of accountability on actions that they think are unjust or unfair.
Mm-hmm.
And you can usually count on a jury to be sympathetic towards an
Mm-hmm.
employee who's had an unjust experience.
What, in your experience, typically happens to the victim? So let's say they do have an EEOC lawsuit. Let's say there is a significant payout. Do you ever track and kind of follow what happens both to, I guess, the perpetrator and to the victim in these situations?
I can't say that I have formally tracked
Mm-hmm.
victims. I have a little bit more experience with the people that are accused of wrongdoing because I used to be, a management side employment lawyer. And for the people who are accused of wrongdoing, when there really is validity that they did something intentionally and it was unethical, then typically they'll be transitioned out of the organization.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of times it will be a situation, as I had earlier referenced, where they're well intentioned but just not thinking through the implications of how
Mm-hmm.
they've exercised their power. In that case, it's a coaching opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
For the people bringing claims, I suspect it's a rough road to travel.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's difficult. I mean, you're going against a company that has every motivation to undermine and discredit your experience, which is
Mm-hmm.
rough in and of itself.
Right.
And then you've got potential implications on future employment. Really.
Absolutely. And now we have a law or laws on the books where individuals who bring forth sexual harassment lawsuits cannot be silenced with non-disclosures, correct?
Correct.
So that's I guess another risk, a large risk now for the organization if they don't take these claims seriously. Because I do suspect it would take a lot for anyone to come forward. And I think the ratio of women to men coming forward just with sexual harassment is maybe what, 4-1?
Yeah, I think that EEOC has a stat on that, and yeah, it's still disproportionately women.
Mm-hmm.
I think the expectation is that will balance out sometime in the future when there are more women leaders than there are today, because it really
Mm-hmm.
is. It's more a function of power than it is gender, and so there's just
Mm-hmm.
disproportionately more men in power than there are women.
There are. And unfortunately, what I've also seen though is that some women feel or have seen power based structures, and that's how people get ahead. And they start emulating that behavior. And, in order to get ahead or they achieve those positions, they feel like that's the kind of behavior that they need to convey. And, so I see those numbers starting to uptick for women as well. And it's not good.
No, we actually just launched a series of micro lessons that we created in collaboration with Professor Joan Williams
Mm,
from UC SF Law School. And she's devoted her career to researching the effects of bias and how to mitigate bias. And
mm,
so, what you just described, she would call the tug-of-war bias,
mm,
meaning whenever you have a underrepresented, more marginalized demographic,
mm-hmm,
they will start to act in a pretty, negative way
mm-hmm,
with other members of their own demographic
mm-hmm,
because it's a fight for that one seat at the table.
mm-hmm,
Right. So your reference, Berta, to women starting to act in a unenviable
mm-hmm,
manner to other women, you could summarize that as, okay, well, that's the tug-of-war bias
Mm,
playing itself out. There's only one seat at the table for a woman. And so the woman, in power is going to attack any
mhm,
and all other women who are trying to get a seat at that table.
mhm. Yeah, absolutely. And I don't know. Have you ever read the book, what is it, 48 Laws of Power by
No,
Robert Greene?
no.
So it actually runs through, there's 48 laws of power. And if you're ever an individual in a power-based organization, these laws that he talks about are so illuminating. And I suspect most people could sit down there and they could tick off probably at least 40 of the 48 that they have experienced 40 of the 48 in their workplace. And it if you read that book, you see that it's a playbook for some people in corporate America, and it doesn't leave people in the workplace with a great impression. That's for sure. People who want to come into the workplace, into corporate America.
Right. Well, thank you. I wrote that down. I'll take a look.
Yes, yes. And he's very active on social media as well. He gives you small little sound bites of power based approaches. So, what are the keys to resolving sexual harassment, bias in the workplace today? What do you think if you were sitting in that HR seat? Where would you start to make sure that it wasn't occurring within your organization?
I would drill down to the behaviors/skills that create those social dynamics or the social dynamics that you want to have,
Mm-hmm.
and start to up level people's skills and measure where they're at, really. So for diversity and inclusion, I mean, diversity, as you were pointing out earlier, Bridget, is not helpful if you don't have inclusion, right? So
Mm-hmm.
inclusion
Mm-hmm.
is a set of skills. At least we think it's a set of skills. It's allyship. It's leading with curiosity. It's valuing our differences. It's thinking systemically, right?
Mm-hmm.
So as an HR leader, you start to identify those skills and give people the resources and help people along their learning journey to increase that I think of it as a muscle.
Mm-hmm.
Increase those muscles,
Mm-hmm.
increase the respect muscles, and start to measure where you're at.
Yeah, because at the end of the day, the workplace has become so much more complicated, right? And what was okay 5 years ago is not okay today, depending on the group that you're working with, right? And who you're leading and who you're talking to.
I mean, even every time you get a new generation into the workplace,
Mm-hmm.
you're starting from scratch. It's like,
Mm-hmm.
okay, now what are the behavioral social norms?
Yes.
And 20 years ago, when workplaces were vastly more homogenous than they are now,
Mm-hmm.
then the group that was the most represented, it was their cultural norms, and
It
the rest
was.
of us who may
Mm-hmm.
have not have you know been like-minded basically code switched to
Mm-hmm.
support their behavioral norms. Well,
Mm-hmm.
those days are over.
They're over.
And now we've got we have a pluralistic democracy. We have pluralistic workplaces, and there's not necessarily one behavioral norm. I mean, even
Right.
if the C-suite is homogenous, the rest of the workforce is not.
It's not.
And trying to navigate all these different behavioral norms without a framework
Mm-hmm.
is insufficient. And that's
Mm-hmm.
why, as an employment lawyer coming to the table from a policy perspective, because all
Mm-hmm.
employment lawyers are like, okay, what's your policy? Well,
Right.
the policies are necessarily written in a very broad, very general way.
Mm-hmm.
They're not, a policy doesn't develop skills.
Mm-hmm.
They're two separate things.
And if you're going to have a decentralized leadership structure, which most corporations do, the middle managers are the company representative. And I think I saw a stat the other day, like over 80% of employees look to their manager as the company.
Yes. Yes.
That's how they define it. It's my
Yeah.
manager. And so their behaviors indicate what they believe about the corporation. It's a talk about power, very powerful seat, middle managers.
Exactly right. And I think that, for the most part, organizations skip over that.
Mm-hmm. I
So
think they do.
they don't invest enough energy, enough resources to really empower that direct manager role,
Mm-hmm.
because they are the company representative.
They are. They are. So stop cutting training budgets. Stop cutting and put in place infrastructures to help support your culture. Okay, so we are unfortunately coming to the end of our conversation. I wish we could continue. And we do something at the end called rapid fire questions. So these are one sentence questions, typically one sentence. I think we have one that's maybe two here, that I ask in one sentence, two sentence answers so that our audience gets to know you a little bit better. Are you willing to play?
Of course.
All right, let's do this. What are you currently reading, or what have you read recently that you could recommend to our audience?
Okay, so I just started reading the American Prometheus because I want to see the Oppenheimer movie.
Say that title again because you cut out just a little bit.
It's the American Prometheus, and
Mm.
it's connected to the Oppenheimer movie.
Love it. I can't wait to go see that.
I know.
If you could have a gigantic billboard anywhere with anything on it, metaphorically speaking, getting a message out to millions or billions, what would it say and why?
Oh, okay. So one thing that I always say to M trainers are our strengths are our weaknesses, and our weaknesses are our strengths. And so the idea being that, we always, I think, bemoan our weaknesses, but because they're weaknesses, we're usually like very intentional
Mm-hmm.
in addressing them. And that intentionality and that deliberate kind of focus starts to make them really large strengths.
What is the biggest problem you or your team solved in the last year?
I would probably say learning to focus in a multifunctional kind of organization, right? So it's really easy to have a level of noise and distraction. So the priorities and the focus get blurred a little bit. And I think since the beginning of this year, we've gotten very, very strong at bringing into clarity our focus that applies cross-functionally.
What advice would you give someone who is just starting out in HR?
So I think it would be really helpful for early and journey person HR professionals to really spend time in the different aspects of HR, right? So um, in a proactive way. So you've got, performance management, you've got employee relations, you've got HR strategy, you've got comp and benefits, and just spend the first couple of years getting at least a broad understanding of each component.
What's one of the biggest mistakes you've encountered throughout your career, and what did you learn from it? And it doesn't have to be your mistake. It could be someone else's.
I think it's been my mistake, and I've allowed others to make this mistake on my team as well. I think it's being unrealistic and biting off more than we can do. And that connects to my earlier comment on focus. So you don't get an ROI unless you're realistic about what you can actually materialize, right? So less is more, and just make sure that you can actually get it to a finished product and materialize. And this applies really regardless of your role in the organization. Certainly for HR leaders, bite off less and make sure that what you do bite off, you can materialize in a really impactful way, so that you start to generate the velocity from that project before moving on to the next.
Wise words. What's a tangible next step that our listeners can take back to their businesses and start implementing tomorrow?
Well, in light of what we've been talking about, I would encourage folks to download. We've got our 16 skills matrix, right, which is the downloadable on our website, emtrain.com, and just start to look at it, because I suspect that most organizations, even when they have a skills taxonomy, they're probably not addressing the skills that lead to compliance and healthy culture, right? So, at least start looking at that and think about what you can do as an HR leader to develop those skills in a measurable, objectively measurable way.
So today we have been joined by Janine Yancey, CEO and founder of Emtrain. Thank you again for joining me, Janine. It's been such a pleasure.
Same here. Thank you so much.
I really hope you enjoyed this episode. Thanks so much for watching. We would love it if you shared your thoughts on any of the topics we discussed in the comments below. And if you got value from the video, it would mean the world to us if you hit the like button and subscribe to the HRMorning channel. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you next time on Voices of HR.